Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to our webinar, The Early Years of HMAS Platypus, the once submarine base in Neutral Bay. My name is Tor Lund. I'm the Secretary of the Friends of Holbrook Submarine Museum and the convener of this webinar this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists this evening, starting off with your host, which is David Michael. David served in most branches of the RN from 1973 through to 2009, mostly as a logistician, but we like to think of him as an honorary submariner because he does help us quite a bit in our work, and he's been very good enough to come along and talk with us this evening or present this evening. But of course, he spent about 18 months in Platypus, based at as a squadron supply officer before relocating with the squadron to Western Australia, where he spent a further 3 years in HMAS Stirling. He was a squadron supply officer and a director of submarine training and systems, and responsible for the Collins-class submarine training and phasing out of Oberon training and the submarine escape training facility. Today, he's president of the Naval Historical Society. David will take us through some of the history and developments of the base itself. Our second speaker for the evening is Peter Horriban, MBE. Peter Horriban is a submariner who was lucky enough to enjoy a career in industry, usually in support of the submarine community. He served in submarines based in Platypus or in Platypus itself, or in postings associated with Platypus from 1968 to 1985. He had the privilege of commanding HMAS Onslow, Otway and Otama in that period. For a time, he was a submarine squadron operations officer. He's put this in here, my name is Sue. So, where his job was to support the operations of submarines at sea. Later, he was the founding president of the Submarine Institute of Australia, Incorporated. He is the leader of the Submarine Institute of Australia's project to establish the Australian National Submarine Museum. That last but definitely not least, looking very dapper tonight, and he did threaten to wear his overalls and also carry a torch, which I think he does have with him, with Sandy Feligas. He was a warrant officer, artificer, and a submariner for almost 40 years of service or more. His experience with maintenance and delivery of services to the growing submarine squadron of HMAS Platypus in those early years was legend, and also he will provide insights into the issues he encountered keeping the boats at sea, which is what we were all about. Sandy's going to give us his observations on maintaining the submarines, the unique equipment, and of course the skills required to do so. So without too much further ado, I'd like to hand over to David now to start us off. So David, you have the con.
Thank you, Thor. My time in the squadron was very satisfying. Actually, it was an interesting period with the transition from east to west and also from Oberon to Collins. So I learned a lot about submarines. And really, Australia's got a really rich submarine history, and Platypus is a large part of that. The history of Platypus obviously is synonymous with the Oberon-class submarine as well. Yeah, we operated them for 33 years. But before discussing the construction of the base, I'd just like to show you what the site looked like going back in time. The first slide is a watercolor from the mid-19th century. And that basically is painted from the North Shore, as it was called in those days, looking northeast across Neutral Bay towards Cremorne Point. The site is marked. The next one is a similar view, but this time you can see Garden Island in the background. And Garden Island had been supporting Royal Navy warships for 80 years at this time. Then in the late 19th century, in 1867, again, Neutral Bay was not a very desirable suburb at that time. And so it became the site for a gasworks, a small gasworks built in 1876. And that gasworks continued to grow over time. And in 1884, it was expanded significantly. It's just that previous slide, you notice the red circle, that building we'll come back to later on. Now, yeah, this image is in the 1920s. This is after the gasworks had expanded, and it went on producing gas until 1932, when it became unfinancial and it was closed during the Depression. It then lay derelict for just over 10 years until it was purchased by the federal government, or taken over by the federal government during World War II, and it became the torpedo factory, or the site for a torpedo factory. This next slide is showing the torpedo factory under construction. The long building in the foreground, later on, 35 years later, became the Platypus workshops. Then this site, obviously after commissioning, and I'll come back to the crane later on, but what's significant here is the large torpedo factory, which later became the torpedo maintenance establishment to the left of the slide, and the office just behind the fin of the submarine. But when Platypus was constructed, it still had that large gasometer looming over it. Okay, but my story really starts in 1947, and in Sydney we had the Royal Navy 4th Submarine Flotilla. It was based here from 1947 to 1969, and those Royal Navy submarines were basically contracted to the RAN and the Royal New Zealand Navy to provide ASW training. But in 1961, the British government gave us notice that they were going to withdraw all their forces from the Asia Pacific area. And really that notice of the change was the catalyst for Australia to start thinking about what were the alternatives. Did we want a submarine force? Fortunately, at the time, the Minister for Navy was Senator John Gordon, and the Chief of Naval Staff was Vice Admiral Sir Henry Burrell. And both those gentlemen were long-range, thinkers and understood the capabilities of submarines. Just need to go back one thought. So they became champions, and so the government actually made the decision to go ahead with discussions with the Royal Navy, which started in 1962, and then the decision was made by Cabinet in late 62. And Senator Gordon made the public announcement that we'd acquire submarines and build a base, and that was in early 1963. So there were 11 sites evaluated for the base, 7 within Sydney, and then 4 elsewhere up and down the New South Wales coast. The sites within Sydney Harbour, well, the background to the Royal Navy submarines, they'd been based at Balmoral. So Balmoral was one likely site, but we knew that whenever there was a strong easterly swell, it was very uncomfortable for the boats to be moored at Penguin, HMAS Penguin. So they often relocated to the torpedo wharf, or torpedo factory wharf at Neutral Bay. So we had experience there, and Neutral Bay actually also turned out to be the cheapest of all the sites within Sydney. It was actually half the price of the other 6 sites within Sydney Harbour. What's interesting too is the response from the communities in the areas evaluated, particularly outside of Sydney. Some of them, even though they weren't evaluated, we had politicians lobbying the government. For instance, Whyalla and Gladstone both wanted to offer themselves as sites for the submarine bases. But it didn't take long for the North Sydney Council to make it known that it wasn't pleased with the decision to select Neutral Bay. Amongst the concerns were noise and the threat of being targeted. Obviously, North Sydney and Neutral Bay were highly densely populated areas by that time. we'll come back to noise later on. In fact, the submarines, noise was managed quite well. The Platypus site plan is on the slide, and basically it was projected to cost £2 million at the time, $4 million. And it was based on a population of 400 submariners, officers and sailors. But site preparation and construction of the wharf started in early 1965. And the concrete wharf that was built was 800 feet long, and it was modelled along the very modern wharf in Faz Lane in Scotland, the Royal Navy submarine base. And one of the features was that mobile track crane, which I highlighted earlier on. And it was capable of lifting masts and periscopes out of the submarines and then into the dedicated workshops. So basically, the tenders for the construction of the main new building on the site was the administration building. It was let in 1965. And interestingly, we only had 20 months to build the new buildings. So that new administration building featured the staff offices, an ops room, a communication centre, and it had 3 messes for the duty, to provide meals, etc., to the base and the submarines alongside. There was no accommodation on the base. It was provided at HMAS Penguin. That was for both the base staff and the submarine crews. The workshops I mentioned before, the long one closest to the wharf, it featured a mechanical workshop, electrical workshop, the periscope and mast workshop, and a battery shop. The building closest to the wharf was it later became the submarine school in 1981. Okay, the next slide shows the base as it was in the early 1980s. And again, you can see here the administration building on the right, the workshops behind the crane, and later on the submarine school at the back. But the interesting building in this slide, it's the one I circled before in the gasworks photo, is it became the stores building. But in fact, during the gasworks period, it was the retort house. And it's got heritage significance because the steel that was used to construct it is quite rare and quite unique. So it still exists today and it's a feature of the site. Now, that's the retort house there from a couple of different angles. Obviously high grade steel because it doesn't look like it's corroded at all. Now, just to conclude, because I'm a logistician and a bit of an optimist, I'd conclude that the project to actually acquire the submarines and build HMAS Platypus would have been quite a significant and successful project, or it should have been. We'd had a lot of experience with operating the Royal Navy submarines out of Sydney. So we knew, by the time HMAS Platypus was commissioned in August 1967, we had a functional organisation to manage operations and all aspects of submarine capability. We had Cockatoo Dockyard. They'd been repairing and refitting submarines for some 20 years by then. And then you'd also expect that with that experience, we'd be able to get the package right for purchasing support equipment and spares. But remember in those days that the naval store system didn't manage stores items by class of ship. They were just managed by NATO stock number. So you really didn't know whether an item was unique to a ship or a submarine or multiple vessels. So my sense is that the project should have been successful. We had time on our side. We had experience. So one would expect that the early days of the base would have been quite successful. So I'd like to now hand over to my fellow panelists to either support that proposition or counter it. So I'd like now to hand over to Peter Horrobin for his session.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all our guests tonight, particularly Admiral Campbell and Jim Dennis. You both know more about what I'm about to say than I do, so I'd probably do well if I just kept quiet. However, I will press on, as you would expect. Also, Jumper Collins could keep me straight. I first saw Platypus in October 1968. I was navigator of Otway. I'd left the boat in Fremantle to take some natives leave and then rejoin my boat in mid-October 68. The administration building was very new, as David's just explained, very clean, and seemed to me to be a good place to start a new enterprise. Most of the Australian submariners that existed at that time were still in UK under training or serving in RN boats. So the Platypus-based staff at that stage comprised the Brits who were about to go home, and you could see them packing their bags, and some general service sailors who were trying to work out what these black things were. Oxley had been running from Platypus at that stage for some 12 months, and it had taken upon itself to educate the squadron staff on how a submarine should be looked after. The nature of this relationship was most clearly demonstrated when somebody from Oxley decided to redecorate the ceremonial lifebuoy outside the captain's office or the squadron commander's office, so that he amended, or the motto for Platypus, nothing too difficult, was amended to read nothing too difficult. Otway was the second sibling in the family, and we endeavoured to keep our heads down and to make sure that the elder brother took the heat. Platypus was an idyllic spot to have a submarine base, at least we thought so. Arguably, our neighbours had a different view. A compromise was reached so that we didn't run our engines at night, as David indicated. And one of the points that some people missed is the bay itself was quite shallow, so that at low water, the amount of water beneath the keel of an Oberon was about 1 metre. Some of our more dashing submarine commanding officers rediscovered the concept, or rediscovered shallow water effect, as they approached the berth with great panache, went full astern, and found themselves up in amongst the yachts at the northern end of Neutral Bay, or visiting the customs facility on the other side of the bay. Getting out of Platypus was also interesting. No boat swings up into wind when going astern. And the wind in that area either is from the sort of southeast or from the west. And unfortunately for me, my experience was to find myself thrashing around like a playful whale in the front garden of Kirribilli House. On one occasion, I was in that situation and was sort of relieved to find that Pierre Trudeau, the then Canadian Prime Minister, was giving us a happy wave. He wasn't quite as nervous as Sandy's cartoon suggests. He was quite amused by the whole thing. The nature of our operations in that period, as David has indicated, was to support the fleet in anti-submarine warfare training. And we call that being a clockwork mouse. It involved diving at about 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, tracking south until about midnight on Wednesday, and turning around and tracking north till about midday on Friday, whereupon our surf ship mates would crank up to sort of 28 knots and zoom off and go home for dinner. We would come in very much later because we weren't that fast. The concern that many of us had at the time was that we weren't developing our own skills as submariners. The sort of things I'm talking about are surveillance operations, inshore operations, anti-shipping operations. What the bread and butter of what submarines are supposed to do in the Cold War period, being pinged upon by a surface ship from a range of about 2,000 yards, steering south at 180 feet, is not exciting. We complained about it, saying we were worried about losing our skills, and so the fleet staff very generously allowed us to stay at sea over the weekend so that we could get up our training. I'm not sure who won that argument. To quote or to misquote Gilbert and Sullivan, life as a clockwork mouse was not a happy one. On the other hand, the squadron, the base, the submarines, it was a very small unit, and we had a lot of fun. And I think it was a happy and united team, which I certainly enjoyed. I think at that stage in our Navy, there really wasn't a great understanding of what submarines actually did. And some of the things we faced were an absence of career structures particularly for sailors at that stage. The problem became worse for officers later on. But at that time, in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, we had very well qualified sailors who were very much eligible for promotion to the next rank, but the formal qualification course which they were required to complete didn't exist. And so we lost a lot of good people because we didn't have a way of promoting them. So at that stage we started to, forced us to face the reality of trying to train our own people and not to rely so much on the Brits. One of the more fun things I got involved with was doing training for submarine RPs to the rank of petty officer. Now, the petty officer RP's course in general service was about controlling fighters from a fighter direction room in an aircraft carrier, which doesn't work in a submarine. And I created we borrowed one of the cubicles in the action information trainer up on the hill in HMAS Watson. Some of you will remember that. It looked a little bit like a stable. Indeed, it was a stable. Up in the hayloft were plotters calling out ranges and bearings and passing out information to people in the horse boxes who were looking at a plotting table and turning that into a command information. I had two very bemused members of the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service calling out bearings from the hayloft to a group of happy submariners down in one of the boxes. They thought we were very weird. It was an entertaining period. I don't recall any serious conversation at that early stage about growing the submarine force. Next slide, please. Thanks. Some of you might recognize some of the people in that image if you can see it through the printing there. On the left, looking at his stopwatch, is Ian McDougall. I was his first lieutenant. That's probably why he was looking at his stopwatch. He probably was getting more information from that than he was from me. Others in the room there are Commodore Jeff Rose and Commander Bill Fisher. But moving on. The process at the time encouraged people who joined submarines and who wished to become submariners to gain some experience with the surface fleet and to volunteer to join submarines. So most submariners, well, all submariners were volunteers. Many of them had already gained some time in surface ships. So we were very lucky, I think, at that time in the submarine community to have, we always had very experienced sailors who were and carefully selected. There were problems from time to time, as we all know. Well, there were shortages. I think that's because we didn't really understand the training pipeline and how long it took to actually qualify people and what it needed to keep people. So there were guys whose seashore ratios were rubbish. You know, I mean, I can remember a friend of mine who was an ABUC. He had done 4 years in Otway. We waved him goodbye and he was walking up the wharf to enjoy his first sort of period ashore. And as he was walking past Oxley, he was told to get down the boat. It was about to, they did sail that moment to the Far East for 6 months, you know, not the way to handle people. The challenge we had also was not having enough training billets. And I guess the other thing that I think was a challenge and still is today, I think, is that nobody likes defects. There is no fun being in a submarine that's lying alongside being fixed. Nobody gets anything done. The techos get tired, the seamen get bored, and nobody loves anybody. So that's one of the other sort of challenges that we were coming to terms with. My view is that the goal of being a submariner is to be professional. That's to be safe and to be effective at sea. And that means you need to maintain your skills. It might sound as if I'm banging on about this, but it's one of my things. And it wasn't, frankly, until the late 70s, until Orion and Atama arrived, that we started to focus on developing professional submarine skills. I think the great success of the period was the submarine weapons upgrade program. I think that was a much underrated and undersold success. I think it was an outstanding success, and quite frankly, within the submarine community, the success of the SWAP program gave us the confidence to believe we could build Collins. I think without that SWAP experience, things would have been much messier at that decision point. At this point in time, I should stop and hand over to Sandy, who will tell you what really was going on in Platypus. Thank you for listening to me.
Good evening. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Sandy Freeligas. I joined boats in January 1969. Did my parts 1, 2, and 3 in the UK. Came back as a qualified submariner in August of 1970. Prior to that, I spent 4 years at HMAS Narimba, training as an ordnance artificer, fitter and turner. My 5th year apprenticeship, I was cross-trained in high-power electrical supply and distribution as the ordnance branch and the electrical branch amalgamated. I then spent 2 years in general service on HMAS Vampire. My introduction to Platypus was not all that auspicious. Myself, my wife and brand new baby arrived back from the UK and no one met us. So I made my own way to Platypus, presented myself at the reg office, and not only did they not know me, but they had no record of me. We soon changed that. My first impressions of the high power workshop, it was small and it was crude. For what they expected us to do, it was crude. I noticed the staff were working on multiple jobs. They looked tired, they looked stressed. It was high power electrics and a high power job. I soon found that the workshop ran on a number of shuns: dedication, adaptation, improvisation, and in a lot of cases, frustration. I'd like $1 for every time I was told, I don't care what you do or how you do it, Chief, but the boat must remain operational. So we did what we had to do. Looking back, I blanch at some of the things that I did. Familiarity breeds contempt. HMAS Platypus, I'll refer to as Plats from now on. Plats was unique. We were isolated across the other side of the harbour from general service. They called us McHale's Navy. We revelled in it. The thing I liked most about Plats was the sailors did all their own work. There were no unions affiliated in Platypus. That meant we could do what we wanted, when we wanted, how we wanted, without any outside interference. A boat would come alongside and would be met by base staff to see if it needed any assistance. It was given VP and CP shore supply and shore charging cables. Power was provided from a powerhouse that was in Plats itself, crewed, of course, by sailors. Manpower was always a problem, especially if you had a boat alongside that required a job that needed shift work. You then had to juggle as best you could the troops you had left to carry out the normal type of maintenance. We were quite proud that the gantry crane on the wharf was the only non-unionised crane on the Sydney waterfront. It was driven by specially trained stokers from the engineering section. With manpower, as I said, we were always behind the 8 ball. Jobs were planned in the planning office, in the admin block, then passed to the regulating office in the workshops, and then farmed out to various lads. It was called a regulating office. It wasn't a room. It wasn't even a niche. It was very, very small, very cramped. I remember one Admiral's inspection. The Admiral looked in the reg office and he said to me, "You haven't got much room." My reply was, "It's appropriate, sir. We haven't got much staff." I got a filthy look from him before he left. What we did though in Plats was we tended to work our troops one grade above their rank. That was where it was possible and within reason. The lads seemed to relish that and took it on without any problems. We go to the high power workshop. We got problems there. Firstly, my OA's toolkit, Ordnance Artificers toolkit, fitter and turner. So I was given a comprehensive set of Whitworth and BSF spanners. Unfortunately, on a submarine, only very few of the machinery had Whitworth and BSF spanners. They were all metric. Naval Stores decreed that I was not on an allotment for any metric spanners. So to work on the naval equipment, I had to go out and buy my own, which were always being borrowed and not returned. Now in the slide we have on the right our lathe. The lathe was a reject from the engineer's workshop. It was out of tolerance, but we used it to skim off the commutators on motor armatures. In the left on the corner, in the corner of the workshop, is the plastic injection moulding machine. Now this machine was found in a rubbish tip, a civilian rubbish tip. It was brought back into the office. We refurbished it to make it work. We handmade all of the brass molds for the different size cables so that they could be joined watertight and pressure tight. The Navy, in its wisdom, decided that civilian gear should be put on a submarine as a navigation aid. The piece of equipment springs to light is the Grimes light, a rotating, flashing navigation light. It's all very well to be put on a hovercraft, to be put on a submarine. It took us quite a long time and a lot of swearing to build a mould and jointing for the cables to make that piece of equipment watertight and pressure tight. What happened there was we got very proficient at this cable jointing, and the CSIRO, whenever they wanted high pressure cable jointing, they came to our workshop for us to do the job for them. On this slide, we have a wall board with homemade spanners. We needed these spanners, we used these spanners. Unfortunately, Naval Stores said they were not a base allocation, so we made our own. To the left, just left of centre, is the pressure pot. Now you wanted to test equipment that was external to the pressure hull before it went down to full diving depth and possibly fail. So you needed to dive that equipment while it was still in the workshop, so there were no hassles. About the time I was in there, Rolex brought out a very, very expensive oyster diver's watch. One of our lads got one of these watches, and you guessed it. We put it in a plastic bag and we pumped it down to 300 feet, which was guaranteed at. It imploded about 175 feet. So, young lad took what remains of his watch back to the jeweler, who was horrified that we actually tried to pressure test it. Through the guarantee, he got a second watch. This one imploded at 250 feet. He got another watch, and this one went down to 300 feet and it held. We were happy, he was happy, and the jeweler was extremely happy. Now, maintaining the boats. Remember, the Oberons were a hands-on, last of the World War II type submarines. They were very maintenance, what's the word? They needed maintenance, a lot of maintenance on the engineering side and on the electrical side. Now, my equipment, the high power equipment, lovingly called farm machinery, because it was big, it was heavy, it was bulky. It had to be for the types of current and voltage that went through it. We were always aware of this voltage and current. It could kill or severely hurt. I didn't have switches, I had contacts. My contacts did not go click, they went clunk. On board we had a telemotor pump starter, a hydraulic pump starter, big, bulky, obsolescent. It worked on a clockwork mechanism so that contacts came on in a timed sequence. If they got out of time, which they often did, you could tell because the starter emitted copious amounts of white acrid smoke. It was a long and drawn out procedure to retime this starter, and you always did it with a book open beside you. To control the, automatically control the voltage and the frequency of the AC motor generators that supplied power to communications and fire control and the sonar, which we called wiggly amps because they're only little. We had magnetic amplifiers. Now the magnetic amplifiers were the most technical piece of equipment that I had on board. I am led to believe that they were used in the gunnery system on the Bismarck. Carbon piles were the heart of the automatic voltage regulator for the 24 volts DC, probably the most important voltage on the submarine. The carbon piles were completely obsolete. We could not get spares anywhere. They did not exist. So what we had to do was rummage through burnt out piles and select discs that looked good enough, little carbon discs that looked good enough, so we could build our own carbon piles. The biggest job of the lot was a replacement of a main generator armature. Rather large casing was split. A 3-ton armature then had to be lifted horizontally out of its casing, lower casing, then moved horizontally to the middle of the engine room, then horizontally down to underneath the engine room hatch, and then corkscrewed vertically out the hatch, having only 12 centimetres all-round clearance. This was all done with pull lifts on a 3-man shift. As I said, done with pull lifts and a stoker driving the crane. Never once did we contemplate passing this job to Kodoc, Cockatoo Island, or to any other outside contractor. Naturally, when you finished the job, you had reams and reams of paperwork filled out in triplicate. We reinforced this by having a handmade poster in the workshop of a sailor sitting on the toilet. The caption was, "The job's not completed till the paperwork's done." The paperwork was then sent to a big Bermuda Triangle somewhere in the Australian bush, never to be seen again. And we come to general service. I've mentioned before that I spent 2 years in general service. I'm very grateful that I did, because I could fully appreciate the difference between submarine service and general service. On a boat, as a branch chief, I was required to read the signal log twice a day and sign it, and then tell my lads relevant information, unheard of in general service. The crew on watch in the control room was right in the middle of everything. They knew exactly what was going on 24 hours a day. They knew, therefore the crew knew. Once again, unheard of in general service. Chief petty officers on submarines kept watches. Not so in general service. A chief artificer, when he was promoted, handed in his toolkit. He was then purely administration. I was still carrying a tool bag as a warrant officer. Senior electricians on board a submarine carried out seaman duties while at sea. My God, don't even mention that in general service. But luckily, not once keeping my seaman's duties did I have to pipe away seaboats crew. And the biggest one of the lot was in submarines. There was no divide between the techos and the seamen. We all respected what each other did. The old saying, we're all in the same boat, all buddies in boats. In general service, I found there was an attitude of them and us, and it was not a pleasant environment in some cases. And all of this was done on the princely sum of $260 a year submarine pay. And we had to fight for that. Now, in conclusion, I feel very privileged and ancient to be part of the squadron in these early years. I saw the squadron emerge from a very expensive training aid for general service to an efficient, potent, and proven standalone offensive weapon. We saw our weapons emerging from those used in the Second World War to weapon systems that then we could only dream about. We worked hard, we played harder. We did the impossible with the improbable, and we did it well. We did it bloody well. And we did it with long hair. We took a fierce pride in our squadron, in what we achieved and how we did it. Finally, if you were to ask any submariner today, if knowing then what we were liable to experience in later years, would they, given the chance, do it all again? I guarantee you that all of us would reply with a resounding yes. My last statement is there is no such thing as an ex-submariner. We are all still submariners. We just haven't got a boat. That's it. Thank you. Roger Ballast Pump. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Sandy. It was my task to do a summation now, but Sandy, those last few words of yours were very useful in summing up the attitude and the characters of submariners. But from my perspective, you've heard three different perspectives on the squadron and those early days in Platypus. I'd like to start by saying that establishing or re-establishing a capability such as submarines is certainly not easy. It's right up there with establishing a fixed wing aircraft capability at sea. It takes time and it takes a lot of persistence. And really, from what you've heard tonight, those who served in both Platypus and the submarines ought to be extremely proud of their service. Their achievements were remarkable. They achieved a lot, and often, as you've heard tonight, at high personal cost. They did the hard yards, and they ended up achieving a safe and fully operational submarine force. It did take about 10 years, as Peter indicated. By the mid-1970s, I think the planners were using the submarines as they were intended. And actually, the first operational deployment, I understand, was in 1969, and HMAS Ovens did that. And they were serious Cold War deployments. So really, they achieved a lot in a fairly short time. I mean, the obvious difficulties we've heard about were all the various elements that make up capability, and manpower was one of the main ones. You needed critical mass to sustain the force. And each category, a lot of categories didn't have that viable manpower structure, as Peter had mentioned. And hence you had career advancement problems and retention problems. The training difficulties you've heard about, and obviously the support equipment either was not provided or wasn't suitable. So there were some serious challenges, but really the persistence and the dedication of those submariners in Platypus and the O'Briens in those early days really paid off. And as Sandy has said, it was an attitude of getting the job done and looking out for each other. In my view, it's a personal view, submariners are an elite force, but that's not recognised in the civilian world or necessarily in the surface world. Submariners like to stay under the radar. However, I guess in recent days, with the advent of AUKUS and talk of the new nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, they're no longer out of the limelight. Look, thank you for listening, and I'd like to pass back to Thor to manage the questions. Thanks, Thor.
Thank you, David. Yes, we have a couple of questions for you. The first one deals with, was any esprit de corps of the squadron lost in moving to Stirling with the submarine force as part of a larger organisation? That's to everyone.
I'm happy to take that one, Thor, if you like. There could be others in the audience that were involved in that transition. Submariners had been in Platypus, in Neutral Bay, for 30 plus years and really didn't know any other environment. So shifting west was a huge challenge. And the squadron Navy went to a lot of trouble to support them in that transition with familiarisation flights, which took wives and families over there. So there was a lot of hesitancy, but once they got there, and the children in particular were given a different program to the parents who went off to see naval housing and the base, etc. The children were taken to the beach by a park ranger, and a lot of Garden Island is managed by national parks. And as soon as the children experienced that and fell in love with the place, it was quite easy for the parents to make the decision to go west. Obviously, there was a lot that didn't move, and the squadron did lose a number of skilled people during the move. But my assessment is that esprit de corps probably remained as strong as it ever was, and the integration, socially and meeting people from general service in the other lodger units in Stirling was a positive thing. They learnt what the rest of the Navy actually did. Thanks.
Another question has come in. Has anyone written the history of O-boat squadrons, including SWAP?
I could take that one if you like, Tor. Mike White's book on the submarine force is probably really the only document, formal document I'm aware of. To the best of my knowledge, the SWAP story hasn't been written. Ian Hill, a submarine schoolie turned WEO, is in the process of pulling bits and pieces together.
Another quick one, I think this one's probably for Sandy, was the early days of tools, as you pointed out. Did that change later?
When I was made up to warrant officer and sent down to Navy office, I got out all electrical drawings of all the electrical equipment on board and put down a list of nuts and bolts that was in that equipment, and made up a list of spanners and requested that they update the Greenies toolkit. I don't know if that went through or not.
Time for one more question that we've got. Probably, I think, for Peter, this one. It says, were there any incidents in manoeuvring around Platypus that you can recall?
Yes. I'm not going to give you any names. Only one of them was Dalrymple. Who was then the squadron commander, and the submarine in question had got itself into a bit of a mess. Its aspiration was to end up alongside Platypus North 1. So if you look at the picture in front of you there, you'll see the fuel lighter lying beside two submarines. the aspiration for this particular submarine CO was that he would be the inboard, the one nearest the wharf. That's where he wanted to be. He's passed his head rope, and I don't know what happened, but basically instead of pulling in on the head rope, he extended it. So the head rope, which is the one, I can't remember how long a head rope was in an O-boat, but it was long enough, was at full stretch. The head rope was right out to its bitter end. The submarine was probably about, looking at that picture again, probably down at the bottom of the picture, quite frankly. And shallow water effect kicked in. So what he was trying to do was hold onto his head rope and wind the stern in and then start to pull himself in with his capstan. A good plan. But the dreaded shallow water effect kicked in, and so all he did was he created lots of mud. And the squadron commander's cheerful advice to him was, "Would you stay there? We'll build the base out to you." It was a fairly grumpy submarine CO, came off the submarine later on.
Okay, I think that's about all we've got time for tonight, and I thank you for your patience, everyone. I know we started a little bit late with a few little technical issues, and thank you for waiting for that to happen. I think it's been an excellent presentation. I'd like to thank our three panellists very much for their time and the input. These things don't happen overnight. There's a lot of preparation goes into these. So with that, I'd like to close the evening off, and I'll restate the point that we have recorded this session tonight, and it will be available sometime in the future when I get around to editing it a bit on YouTube. If you want to see the other two that we've done this year, the one that was to do with submarine escape and rescue, and earlier the expeditions to the AE2, they're already up there on YouTube. You can get them through our website too if you want to go there and check those out. Otherwise, I'm sure you'll find that if you're not a member of the Naval Historical Society, you should be. And if you haven't thought about joining the Holbrook Submarine Museum, friends, that's another one. And of course, the Submarine Institute of Australia, all three have come together to bring this to you this evening. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And with that, I will close the evening off. Thank you all for being here. Good night.